Greetings, everyone. My name is Naluembe Binaisa, and on behalf of the Photodemos Collective, I would like to welcome you all to our series of 6 conversations over 3 days, and really thank you for joining us today through Zoom from your different time zones on our one planet. I would like to hand over to Christopher Pinney for a brief introduction before we start our first session. Christopher.
Thanks, Nalu. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of a series of 6 conversations on the theme of citizens of photography. I want to provide a very brief 3-minute background to the project out of which this has grown, Photodemos, the camera and the political imagination, funded by the ERC, and which is now drawing to a close. At the heart of this has been an ethnographic investigation in diverse parts of the world into the political potential of the camera as part of everyday social practice. It transposed questions which usually only get asked about photojournalism into the sphere of vernacular or demotic activities. It is also, under the influence of thinkers including Ariella Aisha Azoulay, Elizabeth Edwards and Karen Strassler, explored the unpredictable destinations of photography and treated the image as exorbitant and unruly, rather than the compliant prisoner of discursive regimes. As Karen wrote in a most recent book, images are always eventful, taking place and open-ended. The photograph, to recall the title of Jennifer Bajarek's recent book, remains perpetually unfixed. You will hear a lot more about the findings of the project in the following sessions, in each of which one of the Photodemos Collective will be speaking. Before I end, I want to recall that this series of conversations first took shape in a major conference planned for March 2020, and which was cancelled with 1 week's notice as the shadow of COVID fell. We had also planned a rebooted physical event during this week, which has given way to the 6 virtual conversations, which will unfold over the next 3 days. We'd like to thank the patience, persistence, and good grace of the participants who've stuck with us throughout these tribulations, and welcome the different and distributed audience that hosting on Zoom facilitates. We hope also that running this as a live collective event rather than a webinar contributes an unruly energy to the proceedings. So welcome, everyone. And with that, I'll pass back to the session chair, Naluembe Binaisa, one of the collective.
Thank you, Chris. Just a few words of housekeeping about how we're going to run this session and the sessions to follow over the next 3 days. First of all, we are recording and live streaming on YouTube, and the YouTube link will be made available in the chat as well as on our Photodemos website. Secondly, I'm going to introduce the 3 speakers, as will other chairs to follow. And then after they speak, they're all going to give brief presentations, because we want to leave as much time as possible for an interactive conversation. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. You're all going to be muted, and you'll only be unmuted once we get to the Q&A session. And we'll be taking live questions, which you can facilitate by raising the yellow hand. And oh yeah, some people have got a brown hand they can raise. Or you can put it in the chat, and I'll try and pick them up together in the chat for our audience to engage with, or for you to engage amongst each other. Okay, without further ado, I'll introduce our session. The first session is entitled Image Events, and we've got 3 outstanding and complementary speakers, Karen Strassler, Elizabeth Edwards, and Konstantinos Kalantzis. Karen Strassler is a cultural anthropologist at City University in New York. She's a leading scholar focused on the intersections between visuality and political imaginaries, and whose groundbreaking books, Refracted Visions, and her most recent, Demanding Images, Democracy, Mediation, and the Image Event in Indonesia, are a must-read for all of us interested in this field. Elizabeth Edwards is a visual and historical anthropologist, Professor Emerita in photographic history at De Montfort University, Andrew W. Mellon, visiting professor at V&A Research Institute, and honorary professor in the Department of Anthropology at UCL. She is an outstanding, as you all know, prolific author, specializing in the social and material practices of photography with many achievements to her name. And finally, but not least, Konstantinos Kalantzis, who researched photography in Greece for Photodemos. Kostis is assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Thessaly. He works on the intersections of visual culture and political imagination and has published extensively in journals drawing on his fieldwork in rural and urban Greece. His recent book, Tradition in the Frame, Photography, Power and the Imagination in Sfakia, Crete, is an important contribution to the field. He's also director of the ethnographic film, Dowsing the Past. So without further ado, I pass over to our first speaker, Karen Strassler.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good night, wherever you are. Thank you so much. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the ancestral lands of the Lenape people. And I also want to wholeheartedly thank Chris Pinney and the Photodemos Collective and everyone who's making this event happen. I'm so honored to be here with these wonderful panelists and excited for the next few days. And of course, thank you to everyone in the audience for being here. So I need to share my screen, and I'm sorry, there seems to always be a little bit of a delay when I do this. So apologies while I get it going. Oops. Okay. Can you now see, sorry. Why is it not letting me?
You can see it. I think you just need to go to full screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to. There we go. Okay.
That doesn't seem to have done it, Karen.
It will. It just
will. Okay.
delays. I don't know why. Okay, so here we are. Everyone's good? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So a few weeks ago, on the 27th of July, a video of two Indonesian military officers roughly subduing a young Papuan man, Stephen Yadohamang, at a food stall in a restive region of West Papua began to go viral. A still image pulled from the video and in some cases reworked as a drawing or juxtaposed with text and other images also began to circulate. The still showed a man with a dark brown face down on the ground, one soldier straddling him, a knee in his mid-back. The soldier's skin, of course, is noticeably lighter, and the other soldier places a booted foot on the back of the man's head. The video, taken the previous day by a bystander, was 1 minute and 21 seconds long. In it, the officer's boot presses on the man's head for approximately 12 seconds. By pointing out the brevity of this encounter, I in no way mean to diminish the abuse of power evident in this incident, in which the victim was a deaf-mute teenager, and certainly not to call into question the ongoing state violence, political oppression, and systemic racism that has characterized the Indonesian presence in the region. Rather, I want to point out that the incident, while disturbing, was not in itself particularly unusual, and it pales in comparison to many other acts of violence suffered by Papuans at the hands of the Indonesian military. It was the image, more than the incident it recorded, that mattered. The image mattered, of course, because of its resemblance to the image of George Floyd with Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck. Selecting and circulating the image of the boot on the mute man's head in Papua and drawing attention to its similarity to George Floyd's image allowed Papuan and other activists to tap into the political potency of the image event that was the murder of George Floyd. Since the foundational work in social theory of Gabriel Tard on the contagion of imitation, and in more recent work on iconic images, the social force of repetition has been noted. Scholars working on iconic images have argued that it is through their repetition, circulation, and reworking that iconic images accrue value, affective charge, and political efficacy. The Papuan image gained traction for its iconicity, or to use a less technical word, its resonance with other images. This resonant quality enabled it to condense into a powerful visual form the pervasive everyday violence that people in Papua are confronted with in their interactions with Indonesian authorities. Resonance was also what gave it the ability to garner attention and response among those who might otherwise have paid little heed, but who were already primed to respond because of exposure to other similar images. Drawing on Michael Warner, anthropologist Brian Larkin has argued that perceived resemblance with local conditions and concerns motivates uptake of distant images. Larkin's goal is to move away from technologically deterministic accounts of circulation by highlighting the social and cultural factors that make some images desirable. His aim is also to recognize the agency of those on the consuming end of globally circulating images. Here, I developed this emphasis on agency further to think about the ways that people actively generate resonant images. While words like imitation and repetition can imply automatic or derivative copying, I want to highlight the skills involved in harnessing and producing visual resonance. The term image event, which I develop in my book, Demanding Images, was first coined to describe image-ready spectacles designed explicitly in order to draw media attention and circulate as images. And examples of this would be actions undertaken by environmentalist NGOs like Greenpeace or the Al-Qaeda attack on the World Trade Center. In the book, I try to expand the term scope beyond the intentionally staged image event to include more spontaneous and opportunistic ways that images become focal points of debate and affective engagement. More broadly, I advocate a way of conceptualizing all images as happenings that unfold in unpredictable and emergent ways across time and space. The event, writes Deleuze, is a vibration. Thinking along these lines, I try to draw attention to the reverberating dynamism of images, to the ways that they move and mutate and resonate. And this allows us to conceptualize them not only as unbounded and unfinished, but as political events in their own right, rather than reflections, representations, or commentaries on events. It also draws attention to the significance of acts of making, reworking, circulating, and scrutinizing images as an increasingly important way that ordinary people practice citizenship and enact political agency. While the eruption of image events can be spontaneous and unanticipated, it is often the case that an unfolding image event is cannily seized upon to mobilize, incite, and further the public visibility of competing political projects. The George Floyd case, which of course everyone is all too familiar with, but forgive me while I sort of run through it through the lens of the image event, because it really can be seen as a paradigmatic image event. Floyd's killing, of course, might not have registered beyond a small and relatively disenfranchised community of witnesses and people close to him, except that it was recorded by a bystander. And as we all know, that recording circulated via social media, creating an expanding affective public around the image. The force of the video of Floyd's murder rested not only in its status as credible evidence of horrific brutality, but also in its searing affectivity as Floyd's pain and suffering were viscerally conveyed in the image. As it traveled, leaving anger and horror in its wake, it spawned iterations that drew out, particularly as it was framed as a still image, the iconic resonance and metaphoric potential of Chauvin's knee on Floyd's neck, making a singular event stand for and resonate not only with similar viral videos and images and murders, but also with a whole history of racial violence and oppression. Amateur viral video and political cartoons, memes, handmade placards, and murals stirred emotion and helped convene publics, moving a significant proportion of them to take to the streets, where they, of course, took and broadcast images of themselves and were pictured by the media, and so on in ever radiating, widening scope. Now, some would say, of course, that the George Floyd image event did not change anything materially or structurally. Derek Chauvin was convicted, but Black people are still dying at the hands of police in the United States, even when body cams and bystanders are there to record it. But this image event, like all image events, is ongoing and unfinished. We cannot yet know the full extent of its ramifications. Epitomizing Ariella Azoulay's argument that the citizenry of photography extends beyond and transcends any state sovereignty, making possible new kinds of claims and forms of political recognition, the George Floyd image event provided opportunities not only for distant people to show solidarity with Blacks in America, but also to call attention to their own conditions of systemic racism and racialized state violence. The Western media reported breathlessly on BLM protests in sympathy with George Floyd in France, London, the Netherlands, Nigeria, Kenya, Israel, Brazil, South Africa, and so on. Now, especially when it came to places like Papua, this reporting all too often portrayed the US-based protests as sparking, generating, and inspiring protests in other places. An LA Times headline read, "George Floyd's death inspires an unlikely movement in Indonesia, Papuan Lives Matter." A Reuters piece was headlined, "Black Lives Matter rallies Papuan activists in Indonesia." The Japan-based Nikkei Asia ran a story titled, "George Floyd Protests Inspire Campaigns Against Racism Across Asia." In some cases, the actual articles have some solid reporting that acknowledges longstanding local activism around racism, but the headlines replicate a logic of movement from metropole to periphery. It is as if it took George Floyd's image to make people aware of and spur them to action against their own oppression. Before I continue, forgive me, but I want to give a little background on West Papua for those in the audience who may not be familiar with the situation there. And it's obviously very complicated. I'm going to give a very brief account. So when Indonesia gained independence in 1945 from the Dutch nevertheless maintained their control of the colonial territory on the island of Papua, which was then called Dutch New Guinea. And this region is perceived to be racially, ethnically, and culturally distinct from the regions that became Indonesia at that time. So this was to be a temporary guardianship until the people of Papua were deemed mature enough to govern themselves. In 1963, a negotiated agreement led to the transfer of the territory to Indonesia for a sort of period of stewardship with a promise to hold a referendum that would determine the future of the territory. This referendum, or an absurdly rigged version of it, took place in 1969. It was perversely called the Act of Free Choice. And this led to formal incorporation of the resource-rich region into the nation state of Indonesia. And this has been a source of conflict since that time. There's been a pro-insurgency movement a pro-independence insurgency movement in Papua that began in 1965 and has continued to this day under the banner of the Free West Papua movement. And in response to that insurgency, between 1977 and 1998, the area was an occupied military operations zone, so very extreme military repression in the region. That occupation or operation ended officially in 1998 with the return to democracy in Indonesia, but there is still ongoing military presence in the region, ongoing restriction on freedoms, state-supported exploitation of resources, and a pattern of migration of non-Papuan Indonesians to the region that contributes to racial and ethnic tensions. Frequent crackdowns on protest include the torture, imprisonment, and killing of pro-independence activists there. And when Papuans travel to other parts of Indonesia, most notably as students at Indonesian educational institutions, they are exposed to a lot of overt, sort of raw, ugly racism and stigma. They're often called backward and primitive, and yet the Indonesian government and Indonesian society in general does not recognize racism as a problem and frames the conflict as a purely political one of a separatist insurgency that threatens the integrity of the nation. Okay, so the headlines that I noted earlier suggested that Papuan Lives Matter was imitative of and given impetus by the protests in the United States. But as Veronica Kusumaryati argues in an excellent recent article in Critical Asian Studies, and this is a quote from her, the emergence of Papuan Lives Matter is both a specific local response to Black Lives Matter and a continuation of West Papuan anti-racism struggles. Kusumaryati describes not only the deep roots of Papuan resistance to Indonesian colonial rule, but also a decades-long history of Papuans aligning themselves with global Black movements for equality and justice. In the 1970s, as Kusumaryati details, Papuans expressed their Black identity via popular culture, through hair and dance styles and musical bands with names such as Black Brothers. And in an example of a kind of dialogue between Papuans and anti-racist movements elsewhere, in 1972, the US civil rights organization, the NAACP, formally protested Indonesia's annexation of Papua in a letter to the UN Secretary General. So there's nothing new about Papuans identifying with and being recognized by global Black anti-racist movements, even if it comes as a surprise to the LA Times. Sorry, didn't mean to go ahead there. So the image with which I began was not, in fact, the first time that Papuan activists selected, isolated, and reframed an image in order to establish resonance with the George Floyd image. In the summer of 2020, as protests responding to the murder of Floyd mushroomed around the world, an image of a Papuan man, Obi Kogoya, also began to circulate, or rather recirculate, sometimes paired with the Floyd image, as here, and sometimes on its own with the hashtag Papuan Lives Matter. The image showed Kogoya face down, his head pressed in the dirt by a sneakered foot. It was taken in July 2016 when police raided a peaceful protest in support of the United Liberation Movement for West Papua by Papuan students in the Javanese city of Yogyakarta. Obi was beaten and later arrested and charged with injuring a police officer. In addition to the police brutality, a crowd of people gathered, calling the protesting students pigs and monkeys. While the image of Obi Kogoya with a sneaker pressing his head into the ground circulated in 2016, a different image of him from that same event at the time picked up steam as an image event. And what this image, in which Kogoya is viciously dragged by the nostrils and his face is distorted in a grimace of pain, viscerally visualized, was a frequent complaint of Papuans that Indonesian authorities treated them profoundly, inhumanely as animals. Okay. The issue of dehumanization was at the forefront of a major wave of protests that began in the summer of 2019 in response to another attack on Papuan students, this time in the Javanese city of Surabaya. It was during these protests that the hashtag Papuan Lives Matter began to be used, a year before the George Floyd case. In that instance, once again, protesting Papuan students were attacked, first by vigilante groups and then by the police, who beat and taunted them with the same epithets of pig and monkey. Viral videos of this violence spurred protests by Papuans in West Papua and various Indonesian cities, which was then, of course, followed by government crackdowns and arrests of activists. As anthropologist Sophie Chow traces, the governing image of the 2019 protest was not the shoe to the head, but the monkey. In some cases, protesters sought to reclaim their humanity, bearing signs reading, "I am not a monkey." And although this is published in 2020, I believe it's an earlier image. In others, they embraced the monkey as a sign of victimhood and radical difference from Indonesians. Memes featured monkeys holding flags that said "resist," and protesters and activists wore monkey masks or wrote "monkey" across their chests. The image of the monkey drew attention to the lack of basic dignity and humanity accorded to them and reflected back to the Indonesian public their own racist gaze. During the 2019 protests, the image from 2016 of Kogoya being grabbed by his nostrils resurfaced, now framed with the words, "Papuans are humans, not monkeys." So it was only in 2020, in response to the George Floyd image event, that the image of Kogoya's head being pressed into the ground was resuscitated and recirculated. Kogoya became Indonesia's George Floyd. As the Indonesian activist and academic Elvira Rumkabu stated, or was quoted saying in an article in Foreign Policy, "In Papua, we have a lot of names like George Floyd." She continued, "Papuans share the anger of Black Americans, and we are demanding now that people around the world, but especially Indonesians, realize that we have the same suffering here." To conclude, I'm sorry, one brief moment. According to Elvira and other activists, the analogy effectively drawn between Papuans and the far better recognized and readily condemned racism against American Blacks, a resonance made palpable by visual means, has caused Indonesians to begin an unprecedented reckoning. Seeing themselves in effect by way of George Floyd has been an uncomfortable and eye-opening experience for many Indonesians. So to conclude, the media narrative about Papuan Lives Matter perpetuates a colonial logic of belatedness, whereby political agency originates in the Euro-American metropole, but a closer look at this image event reveals less unidirectional patterns of convergence and strategic alignment. Challenging pernicious colonialist narratives does not mean ignoring the durable political economic asymmetries that render the scale and intensity of US-based image events greater than those originating elsewhere. But logics of emanation out from a center cannot capture the lateral, recursive, contingent, and convergent unfolding of image events, nor can they do justice to the agency of those who, exquisitely aware of these asymmetries, practice the art of resonance. In today's densely networked, image-saturated media ecologies, image events are increasingly central to political process. Image brokers, to borrow Zeynep Gürsel's term, have become critical, if often unrecognized, political actors who capitalize on the unfinished quality of images. Past images stand ready to be plucked from the archive and reanimated in the present, while the constant feed of new images must be monitored vigilantly for potential use. Both the reactivation of Kogoya's image in 2020 and the selection and framing of the still with which I began and which is shown here, allowed Papuan activists to catch the wave of an already potent image event, to draw on its momentum, to bring attention to and reframe their struggle. While the media narrative portrays Papuans as reactive and merely imitative, I've highlighted the savvy and skill with which activists harness the power of a global image event, culling from their own image repertoire to make resonance happen, thereby to amplify their demands. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We'll move on to Elizabeth Edwards, please.
Thank you. I'm just getting my screen up. Where's it gone? Find it. So I'm just trying to find my screen. There we go. Right, can you see that?
Yeah.
I don't actually really have a PowerPoint, but I thought you wouldn't necessarily want to look at my face the whole time. I'd like to second Karen's thanks to Chris Pinney and the Photodemos Collective, and for everyone here, and for this invitation to this event that we've waited a long time for, and this conversation. It has been a pleasure throughout to work as very tangentially with the Photodemos Collective, and so it's great to be here. What I'm going to do is take a step back and consider the meta-level implications of Karen's very important observation about belatedness and the long-standing colonialist narratives that figure the majority world as backwaters, belatedly receiving and imitating in the taking up of ideas that flow from the metropole outwards. Implied in this statement, too, is that such movements are evaluated through categories of analysis that likewise are generated at the metropole. This is an assumption that I think has beset studies in global photographies, in that despite the impressive critical mass of studies of nuance and ethnographic precision, little has happened to center those periphery models as theoretical explanations in the study of photography. And I use this in a very loose and expansive way. Yet, as Hayes and Minkley have put it in their recent book on photography and history in Africa, visual theory, that is the customary habits of analysis, has reached the limits of its usefulness. Likewise, Trevor Peglan has argued that traditional approaches to doing photography and thinking about photography increasingly feel anachronistic, and I think Karen's paper demonstrated this so admirably. He goes on, these problems seem increasingly extraneous to the larger photographic landscape which we inhabit, and has little to do with the way in which photography is actually practiced, understood, and desired by most people. While the digital has brought about its own theorizations, his comment, I think, has wider resonance. The political center of that debate remains in the categories of analysis with which we are all so familiar. But as a myriad of commentators have noted, categories and their metaphysics are never innocent. What I am presenting here is a corner of a bigger project which considers how concepts of photography developed through studies of global photographies, such as Photodemos, might actually shift the wider analytical tools for photography, rather than just piling up interesting case studies that do little to shift what Hayes has described as a theoretical imbalance of analytical engagement beyond their own remit. My question here, I suppose, is something of a Chakrabartian decentering, in that we need to ask how concepts emerging from global photographies should inform and refigure dominant categories. Further, I think decentering is based in taking people seriously, a political act in itself. And this is what this implies for the study of photography. As Rita Suti puts it, it is constituted by multiple sources of people's knowledge and the different ways of knowing that they mobilize in particular contexts and for particular purposes at different ages, and fueled by different kinds of experience and cognitive resources, and that cannot be ignored. The image event here for me is the eventful, or even eventile, to use Alain Badiou's term, the eventful or eventile encounter with photographs, and therefore what photographs mean for people. The entrenched epistemic tendencies of photographic analysis have deflected attention from the ontological and visceral scream of photography that shapes majority encounters for photographs. It was there, we were there, and by implication, we are here, with all that entails as a political statement. And while this is complicated by the loosening of that connection in digital worlds, it remains a primary desire and dialect in image encounters, whatever the medium. However, uncoded realism, whatever its mode of presentation, has become a variously suspect term across the arts and social sciences. sites of interpretation. And photographic criticism has too often, as Susie Linfield puts it, crippled our capability to grasp the there-ness of the world. Photographic theory has poured scorn on the false consciousness of realists. Seduced by the power of representation of the object, they do not see, as Roland Barthes commented, that the photograph is always coded. Now, while this might be seen an extreme position, and whatever the intellectual problems, the compelling power of the index and the trace in the realpolitik constitution of histories and identities has nonetheless to be acknowledged. The visceral actuality of what people believe about themselves to be is vested in the real, the trace of the ancestor, the trace of land, and by implication, spirit. For as Barthes himself goes on, such scorn is futile, for nothing, he says, can prevent the photograph from being analogical. Exactly so. Such critiques are rendered vacant, even useless, against the demand for the solidity of the object, the presence of the past, the ancestor, the desire for memory, memorialization, or of political action in this ontological realm. For as we all know, the power of photographs is located in the social use of their content, what they show, traced in chemical or pixel, and the way in which they are perceived as authentication of what people believe themselves to be. This is not a kind of naive realism, or simple-minded realism, or romantic indexicality, or sentimental realism, all accusations that have been thrown at ideas of the trace. The ontological scream of the medium becomes the socially required realism, the very basis of social meaning. It is what people want photographs to do. To reduce this to categories of realism that work only as signifying systems, for example, is to elide the serious demands of subject categories as part of the analytical framework. It is patently clear when the photographic trace becomes the site of very real desire to find one's history. To quote an elder of the Nassis blood, when the elders of the blood tribe saw their faces in photographs, they found their parents looking back at them. They knew those expressions intimately and could read their emotions, recollect their stories, and describe how the pictures represent these realities. Here, the real is not a category of critical aesthetic or even semiotics, but experienced as a visceral and phenomenological one. For both historical reality and photographic reality are based here in experience. The realism of the photographic trace as the presence of a recuperable past embodied in ancestors is overwhelming. To quote again, you can see their spirit in them. They are looking at us. As I've said, the desire such a desire has been critiqued in hermeneutics of suspicion, as that sentimental realism, romantic indexicality that I noted, and it's had very negative connotations. However, I think this is an example of how dominant categories of analysis misrepresent majority photographic practices. This photography, such as discussed in the terms I've just quoted, might be effective. It's also effective, for there is nothing sentimental or regressive about the desire for historical recognition, social justice, and survivance that shapes indigenous, post-colonial, and indeed many other majority photographic desires. If photographs are seen, desired, and presented as transparent and unmodified traces, regardless of the photographic modulations in any given instance, they are shifting the categories in which they are put to use. And it's necessary to find categories of analysis and language that can be simultaneously incisive and critical, and which take account of what people need photographs to be. Their encounter, and this is their image encounter, and this is what I find exciting about the work of the Photo Demos Collective and its concepts of citizen. It implies a different language that enables us to think to think how such photographic understandings might be accounted for and re-theorized in alternative historiographies of the image, in which the deep desire for the power of the indexical trace, the ontological power of photographs, it was there, can be accommodated theoretically as a historical analytical modality. As Photodemos shows, the work is moving in that direction on, for instance, local, diffused and multiple photographic practices, on, for instance, the snapshot, domestic or family photographs, on modes of preservation, circulation, or on digital practices, or on the new historiographies of photography itself. How do we position beyond the representational through practices that are profoundly representational? This empirical material might, of course, come from many different histories and politics, post-colonial legacies, refigured modernities, First Nations, Aboriginal, Native American, and even ordinary everyday histories in other parts of the world, but they share processes and desires. If these processes and desires are not attended to and taken seriously, the boundaries are simply reinscribed, and as Ariella Azoulay puts it, our arguments by force remain cramped, limited, and circumscribed. And as a corollary to this, which I can't discuss now, but perhaps we'll address over the next couple of days, there's a range of conversations about, for instance, mimesis, bodily transformation, modes of history telling, the presence of the departed, which emerge from these broader think spaces of photography, which must surely refigure categories of analysis. I should just note in passing that, interestingly, something similar is happening in the discipline of history itself, where those working on theory of history are trying to find a theoretical and interpretive language for a concept of history that challenges the reduction of history to a discursive translation or narratological practice, that real things, good, bad, indifferent, and atrocious, happen to real people. And I think this is important, this correlate in history, because history looms so very large in debates about the political imagination. So perhaps it's time to challenge the terms of analytical engagement and to retool our assumptions and methodologies. As I've suggested, within this, the epistemological question of how things, photographs, are seen and what constitutes an image event for people becomes an ontological one. What is to be seen in the first place? Following Brulin-Latour, one can argue that it is time to retest and reset theoretical linkages about photography and history, and, to quote him, if necessary, to revise from scratch the whole paraphernalia in ways that have a capacity to stop thinking in its tracks, unsettling what we think we know in favor of what we might not even have imagined. Such a strategy will articulate more broadly the seriousness of analytical purpose and its significance for the wider understandings of relationships between history, politics, photographs, and what people want to be. It promises to have profound consequences for how we think about the whole project here, photography, including the basic modus operandi and methodological wherewithal. As well as its political, we need to think about this as well as just its political ramifications and critical potentials. Projects like Photodemos are important because they have the potential to posit new analytical language, to posit photographs as a different form of evental sight that might address this theoretical imbalance. Perhaps we might not merely destabilize extant categories, but have an impact on those categories, positioning indigenous and majority practices emerging, their emerging concepts as legitimate and constitutive players in the analytical landscape, as a disruptive heuristic agenda, photographs that are taken very seriously indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was great. And now I'll pass on to Kostis. Thank you, Kostis.
Yep, just switching on my presentation and let me know if it's visible or not. Can you all see the first slide?
Not yet.
So in my presentation today, I engage this panel's concept of the image event and explore political imagination as it
Steve,
Yes?
we can't see your slide.
No.
No?
Yeah.
Can you spotlight me? Or is it visible now that it's not maximized?
Are you sharing screen, Kostis?
Yeah. Let me
Okay,
try.
we can
Let me
see
try
it now.
again. Can you see
Yep.
now?
That's good. We can see your desktop. If you can open up
Okay,
your PowerPoint.
I'll max it.
Perfect.
How about now? Great. So engaging the panel's concept of the image event, I'll explore political imagination as it emerges in producing, looking at, and exchanging photographs. I'm going to talk about two ethnographic case studies, one on the island of Crete and one in the Greek mainland. And to give you a sense of why these field sites, it is useful to think about how photography placed these areas historically in what was once called in the US media the National Family Album. And I use this term as a way of thinking about photographs' social resonance through gendered perceptions of kinship. So on the left, two of many historical photos depicting the town of Distomo, whose population was slaughtered by the German SS troops in 1944. It is visualized as what Mukherjee calls in Bangladesh the horrific sublime, through a focus on black-clad bereaved widows and their deprived children. And on the right, a 1930s photo by a state-commissioned photographer from the Sfakia region of Crete, where I have been doing fieldwork since 2006. It envisions the area as the nation's male rugged warrior. And to go back to the event and to show you how these are transferred at the visceral level, as Elizabeth was saying, these two photographs sort of show how we move from the abstract level of representation to daily practices. On the right, a man in Distomo at his barbershop staring at an image of himself as an orphan taken by one of the humanitarian expeditions that followed the 1944 slaughter. And on the left, Cretan men in traditional attire at a national celebration in March 2021, embodying in a way the motif of historical photographs. Now, why is the visual construction of these two areas relevant and pertinent today? Because the subjects they evoke have become relevant in the current moment in Greece, commonly referred to as, quote, a crisis. I'm going to leave the problems of this term crisis aside and will refer to the crisis as a historical phase that followed Greece's 2010 bailout deal with the EU and the IMF, officially presented as addressing the country's huge debt. This phase was marked by Greeks' renewed anxiety about their position in Europe. For many commentators, nativism, like that embodied by the Cretan warrior figure, became an attractive possibility in the face of structural adjustments. And the relationship with Germany was repoliticized. The harsh austerity measures and monitoring of Greece were represented thus as a form of violence, evocative of that exercised by German troops during the occupation. And this reflects a well-documented Greek cultural practice of framing the present by evoking the past. Now, to illuminate these perceptions with an ethnographic photo event, in 2019, I am at the commemoration of the Distomo slaughter, which since 2010 has been receiving extensive media coverage. As I'm photographing the event, Greek politicians and bystanders discern my DSLR camera as an indication of professional status, and they ask me to take their picture. But everyone is vexed by a laurel wreath with a German flag deposited there by the German ambassador, and they insistently ask me to edit it out of my frame. During that same period, the demand for war reparations by Germany found a new place in the public sphere, and the residents of towns that suffered massacres fear that gifts like the wreath aim at silencing compensation claims and at softening the memories of German brutality. Okay, so Germany, Greece, the nation envisioned as a bereaved widow or a Cretan warrior striking back. By juxtaposing these two case studies, I am thinking with Ariella Azouley's proposition that photography may open up civic spaces that defy official mandates. I want to understand the work photographs do and the work that is expected of them, to recall Elizabeth Edwards' phrase. Is there a photographic citizenship here? And who are its subjects? How is Greece and Germany experienced in encounters that conjure hosts and guests, perpetrators and victims, powerful and peripheral nation states? The first hypothesis on which I've been working is that Sfakia on Crete presents us with an intriguing paradox. Despite the national expectation that locals resist invaders, most recently Germans, and the locals expressed resentment against tourism as colonialism, Sfakians maintain in everyday practice very warm relationships with the German tourists. And I argue this materializes through and in photography and remains somewhat tacit. Attracted to its mountainous landscape and reputation of dangerous authenticity, German tourists have been visiting the region since the 1960s, and I elsewhere argue that their pursuit accommodated romantic desires that had become problematic in post-war Germany, which they displaced onto Sfakia. Photography was a key component of these desires, evident in the dozens of portraits found in Sfakian households today, which when you ask, people say it was taken by a passing German. They reflect the asymmetrical visual economy of the region. Locals have historically relied on outsiders with cameras to get hold of images of themselves, and these photos enhance the idioms they depict as they are recirculated. And here I have a collection of some images found in people's homes, all of them portraits of themselves or their fathers, and upon inquiring, one hears it was taken by a German traveler. And here I put these because they're very recent. They happened in the last week. These are Facebook posts by people of Sfakian descent or residents of Sfakia, which actually show how people visualize their past. In one instance, they're gathered at the village square looking at footage by, quote, Norwegian anthropologists. Left, a woman posting a picture of herself with her mother, taken by a German man who's remembered as a botanist called Joachim. But what's particularly important for my purposes here is that the photographers went back and gifted most of these images to the subjects in what they described to me as gestures of reciprocity and gratitude, along with a desire to participate in locals' lives. In a way, this reminds sort of Nancy Moon's account from New Guinea about disseminating oneself through gifts. Key to these encounters between the local and the tourist, as narrated to me, is that photography became a common language which the two parties didn't otherwise share, they didn't speak. And the images enabled interactions in the future, and this becomes very evident in these two pictures taken by one of the German visitors who's been going to the area since the 60s, where you can actually see traces of images either held in people's hands or on the photo wall, which in some ways they become the basis for the future meeting. So someone gives a picture and then years later comes and brings another picture, and the local person has that first picture and they talk about it. And photographs of this kind also become sites of affect. For instance, I've heard stories of local people who broke down in tears upon encountering a portrait of their father or mother gifted decades after they were taken by its German photographer. Now, I cannot unpack this here in detail, but hospitality, sort of famously described by Michael Hertzfeld as a mechanism of englobing, incorporating, containing the powerful outsider, is central here. Sfakians experience the guest's admiration along with the pride of offering, which they see as distinctively theirs. And the photo returns contribute to the incorporation of the foreigner along segmentary line. I'm thinking about the model of segmentation here. The German who brings back the photograph in a way becomes our German, who is different from Germany as a category. And these exchanges also deny the monetary character of the tourist local as constellation, which is also very important here. But while this contains hints of citizenry, Sfakians look at these photos in ways that undermine that same possibility, that same collectivity, community. For instance, Sfakians never mention the photographers by name, and they prefer their ancestors depicted in solitary poses. So even in instances like these two, where tourists creep in as Benjaminian tiny sparks of contingency, they are left totally uncommended. And to my persistent questions about who these people are, they might lead, after lots of pressure, to indifferent replies such as, "It was a tourist." Now, I take this stance seriously, and I try to understand it as a form of forgetting, comparable to that described by Jennifer Cole in Madagascar in relation to memories, selective memories of colonialism. And in this case here, I see it as negotiating the fact that rather than being the producers, locals have been historically the anonymous subjects of powerful outsiders. And it also, this selective process of looking at these pictures in such a way, it eschews political issues that come up if one asks about tourism, economic dependence, and Germans' land buying, all of which are very controversial topics locally. So what I call the hospitable gaze in my title involves a nexus of relations mediated by photos. Tourists augment Sfakians' traditionalist self-image, and locals adore their own photographed ancestors, ultimately displacing the photographer's authorship. Even if the citizenship and community that emerges here is a precarious one, however, these photo exchanges trouble the canonical national idea that Germans and Cretans are in opposition, and they do open up possibilities of dialogue and parity. Now, in the little time I have left, I'll take you to the mainland again and explore a different kind of instrumentalization of photography. So I'm back to the towns that suffered from massacres by German troops. First, the local museums, which are quasi-domestic repositories of imagery and are the only public display sites that locals accept, given people's conviction that any representation of the area's past is self-serving and distorts the original events. So these museums are the only acceptable spaces. And both museums are centered on portraits and in fact feature silhouettes for victims whose images were not retrieved. A visual figure is necessary, and that is so that the murdered constitute history, confirming in a way the identification of the historical with the photographic, which was famously diagnosed in the early 20th century by Paul Valéry. For Greek visitors, the staring of these portraits in the museums elicits semi-ritualized canonical responses of exasperation, and it conjures a model of the nation as an essence, brutality seen as a structural German characteristic, targeting Greeks as victims. Iconic historical photos of victims taken by photojournalists like this one of Maria Padiska from Life magazine also feed this pilgrimage to the nation as a victim, with viewers casting themselves in the role of grandchildren of the deceased and personalizing the photos in their own family histories. And I'm here, I can't unpack this now, but I'm hinting to how photography works emotionally beyond the particularities of the specific image, which goes back to the question of indexicality that was mentioned previously by Elizabeth. In these towns, there's also a privileging of empirical immediacy to the past that can be itself understood through photography. Given the political division between accounts of the slaughter among leftists and rightists, people dismiss mnemonic mediation, the process that Marian Hirsch famously called post-memory, which misrepresents, in their view, the raw primal event of the slaughter. The hope that ambiguities, historical ambiguities, will one day be resolved is displaced on cameras as a technology of witnessing. And it's indicative here that in one of the museums in Kalavrita, people waited anxiously for the alleged footage of the slaughter to arrive from the German archives and to purge post-memory noise. Of course, that footage never existed. But people also accept that such footage is impossible to retrieve and project their hopes onto first-hand witnesses, who become, in a way, camera-like bodies that captured the impossible sight. Finally, a modality of display as moral protest exists in these two towns. As a practice, it exceeds the left-right axis and the compensation claim. It's about a wider subject position I call accusatory memory, and it involves showing imagery and narrating the past as a means of inducing shame and Martin J. called in a different context downcast eyes among the perpetrator's descendants. If Germany is an arch metaphor of modernity's surveyor, a notion that has resurfaced today with Greece's monitoring, accusatory memory demands that the German spectators look down and listen. Their gaze no longer commands or surveils. And this returns us to the laurel wreath from the beginning of the paper, that people feared that will enable Germany to be an orchestrator, even in the commemoration of its own crimes. Accusatory practices deny the sharing of a common civic space with perpetrators as long as they refuse to acknowledge their crime and offer an effective apology, and photographs offer the most tangible reason against that prospect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kostis. That was fantastic. Thank you to all three speakers, because you all kept time, which was fantastic, and gives us a good opportunity to really engage in conversation. Please feel free. I do not see any questions at the moment in the chat, but do feel free to either raise your hand as a question or a contribution, or to put something in the chat. So, I mean, I can't see any raised hands, but maybe, let me put on gallery view. I could maybe say something myself. I mean, I've loved all three papers, which in different ways have responded to our theme, or our overarching theme in this session of the image events. And maybe amongst yourselves, I mean, one of the many linkages that I saw amongst your three papers, but one I was thinking about was this kind of both subtle, embedded, and sometimes erupting agency within what Karen Strassler called the unfolding image events, and the relationship between that and iconography, as well as what Elizabeth was saying about this, this call to our scholarship of decentering the dominant categories of analysis. I wonder if you want to kind of respond to each other's papers along those lines.
I could say something. I wanted to say something about indexicality, because I think that too often we think we know what we mean by indexicality, because the way indexicality has been written about and talked about in terms of photography is always in terms of the trace, the evidentiary, the reference back to a pro-photographic reality. And I think that one of the things that we can learn from some of these kinds of vernacular, I don't like that word really, but everyday practices that people have with images, particularly relevant to Elizabeth's paper, is that this indexicality is not limited. Indexicality is not limited to that definition. So I think that what's happened within photography theory is that in response to this emphasis on the evidentiary, we felt that we've had to throw out indexicality too often. I'm talking about sort of the whole field of photography studies in the terms that Elizabeth was talking about, as opposed to thinking about how indexicality itself operates in different ways in different places. It's not unsubject to cultural mediation and to historical mediation. So the idea that the photograph in some way creates contact, right, can mean very different kinds of things in different places, in different moments. So I think that that's something that both Kostis and Elizabeth's papers speak to.
I entirely agree with that, and I think photographic studies, in particular, are sort of outside, shall we say, of the broad anthropological remit, shall we say, has been very resistant to any disturbance caused from outside its own bubble, I think. And I think it's been really quite a problem. So we're landed with these terms like indexicality, which, as you rightly say, means so many different things and is applied in so many different context. I mean, that's a problem, another problematic category. And I think that that sort of triangulation of image, agency, indexicality, and the evental becomes a really important point of disturbance and destabilization. And I mean that in a very constructive way. It gives us a new ways into thinking about the image in the way that I think your paper did so very well. When I was listening to you speaking, I was thinking, oh yeah, that's exactly what I'm meaning. And so I think it, I think they spoke to each other quite well, actually.
If I may, I think indexicality, if I understand you correctly, Karen, is kind of subject to a phenomenological utopianism of locating the really unruly against the coded and the narrow. And in my experience in that field set, but also elsewhere, it's actually never entirely impossible to escape social signification from that sort of more abstract discursive level. Even so, people very often react emotionally to the image in light of what they know and what they've been, what they have been learned, what is encoded with the image, even though they can also trace the minute detail, the indexical minute detail that disturbs them. So these two can actually exist, and people may oscillate between the two. Karen, if I may ask a very short political philosophy, so humor me as I ask this question. Do you, I mean, the kind of images that you showed are very often read in cultural studies, but also even in anthropology and elsewhere, as ultimate signs of emancipation, the liberty afforded by social media, which is probably a corollary to the colonialist narrative you exposed very nicely. My question is, do you also think that at the local ethnographic level, but also at the more philosophical, again, humor me please, do you think there is a normative aspect of these recirculations and these reuses of iconography borrowed from, say, the US, which in fact actually makes people who want to phrase the colonialist narrative of spreading from the metropole actually makes it possible to phrase that argument? Do you think there's something repetitive and canonical and normative about these things, about these recirculations and these reverberations of motifs?
I think inevitably, yes, but that shouldn't disqualify them as being politically enabling. So, I mean, I think that activists are working in a real world structured by all kinds of inequalities and are very savvy about that. And so using images that in some ways may sort of reproduce certain kinds of tropes or reproduce certain normative relations of asymmetry on one level, right? By referring back to Floyd, right? They're reinscribing the centrality of Floyd, but at the same time, you know, they're operating in within under conditions of extreme underrepresentedness, right? In the sort of you know, the world political map, and this is a very important weapon that they have to mobilize images and resonance in the way that I was trying to describe. And I guess what I'm trying to highlight is that this isn't just happening. This is people who are very, you know, have a lot of skill in culling these images and framing these images, in making resonance happen. And that's become an increasingly important political skill. But I think, like all political strategies, it has its pitfalls and limits, of course.
I think what, as I was listening to you speak, what came to mind was Margaret Hillenbrand's notion of the photo form. You know, that she developed in relation to the politics of secrecy in contemporary China. And she uses the photo form to discuss a sort of material and iconographical and political migration of forms across also a vast number of different media, but they become they sort of shadow box the official line of meaning And she's talking about things like the memory of the Nanjing massacre in China, and how these photo forms sort of shadow box the official narratives and articulate things that cannot be articulated in any other way. And it's this material migration and image and iconographical migration which creates the photo form. And I think there's a really interesting parallel there between what you were describing in Western Papua and what Margaret's been describing in China.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I just add to that last point that I was thinking, I mean, thanks, by the way, for 3 terrific presentations, but trying to get to grips with the way in which you talk about resonance, Karen, as an efficacy that is born out of a certain kind of predetermined familiarity. I mean, it put me in mind of that Jameson phrase about, you know, being half heard in advance, half seen in advance. How much of contemporary culture, from pop music to popular visuals, is there's never a first performance of it. It always seeps into one's consciousness in advance. And it struck me that what you were describing so well was as resonance, was a kind of repertoire, a kind of almost fugal set of variations on a kind of relatively impoverished set of possibilities. So that within resonance, nothing would ever truly be surprising, or to put it crudely, nothing would ever really be new, shocking, amazing, disturbing. And that makes me think, well, you know, the kind of utopian narrative about the camera's liberating potential as a tool of photojournalism is that it will show the new, the unseen, the abject, the appalling, the intolerable. So aren't these occupying 2 very different spaces, the one of which is kind of controlled, impoverished repertoire, which produces certain kinds of affects, and the other domain is perhaps where, you know, indexicality comes back in, where contingency, it still has a place. So no, I wonder whether you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think you've kind of pinpointed something really important here. So one of the things I do think that for me, the idea of the image event is something that works backwards as well as forwards. So what makes an image event is often that it kind of pulls on and resonates with prior imagery that, you know, this idea of iconographic migration, I think, is wonderful. And I wasn't familiar with it, so thank you. But yes, I think that there is a way in which, you know, if you look at theories of vision, I mean, what we're seeing is always in some way prefigured, right? And we always see in relation to what we have seen. And that's a lot of how, even when a photojournalist is, you know, supposedly taking a photograph of something radically new, they're either consciously or unconsciously selecting a frame according to all kinds of, you know, prior imageries and prior conventions. And same goes for how we read those images. So this is definitely part of this process. But at the same time, right, if we think about iteration as always introducing something new, there is always change and transformation. And sometimes, right, those changes can kind of be you know, more sort of rupturing, right, of expectation, even as they may recall something prior. So I don't think that the idea of resonance and iconicity is inherently, you know, about a kind of repetition of the same, because I think if we really look at, you know, theories of repetition, Derrida, but also all the way back to Tard, I mean, there is a sense that change is part of every repetition. And that's where the question of the contingency of the event right? The moment and the context and the particular conjuncture around that image becomes really salient.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen. Can I just also take 2 questions from the audience? You can speak and unmute yourself. The first one is from Majubaulo Kome, and the second one is from George Agbo. Please feel free to unmute and show your face.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed these presentations and must confess I didn't hear everything because I was in transit and internet was spotty in certain places. But you know, I wonder the extent to which relations of power that precede the photographing event are taken into consideration seriously. And in terms of the thinking, even by scholars here present, what is the repertoire of ideas from which we draw from? For me, as somebody from Nigeria, you know, global South, you know, developing country, I think the repertoire of ideas in terms of what is authoritative for scholars is drawn from the global North. Predominantly, you know, I live and work in the US, from the West mostly. So the way we frame the thinking about what is happening itself is problematic.
Yeah.
Because we're going into places where there is clear disparity in the power of the beholder and those who are being photographed, even out of a spirit of generosity. And then the people who are doing this photographing or the interpretation of the photographs are not from there. They're powerful, they have more voice, they have been granted more authority as experts than the people that they're interacting with. So if we're talking about decolonizing and, you know, imperialism and so forth, even the scholarship that we do, even when we're well-intentioned, is very colonial, is very imperialistic, because there are relations of power that precede the event that we are in, that have given certain parts of the world more voice, more authority, more resources to go around the world and observe and then interpret what's going on. So for me, this is the thing, you know, if we're talking about citizenship, it seems to me that, you know, the people in the global South are subjects. And then we're talking about icons and so forth. To what extent do the people from the global North draw icons, you know, from the South to talk about politics and so forth in ways that are similar to what's going on? So, you know, I think I'm just troubled by scholarship in general, and I'm a scholar, you know, and the things we do and how we conceive of what we do. And I wonder when we're really going to get to that post-imperial, you know, decolonized way of engaging the world. So more of a comment than a question.
Thank you. And can we take George Agbo, and then please, if the panel could respond to these quite interesting provocations.
Thanks so much to the presenters. I really enjoyed myself. And then to Karen, considering how politically charged photographs get reworked in very different ways as they circulate, how are they publicly received as representations of actual events that are being challenged? So I'm asking this question because of what you've been saying about indexicality. Yeah, we all know the debate around the truth claim of photography. Yeah, we know that photography has never been objective, going back into history. But what about those who who are not in tune with these historical and theoretical groundings of the image or photography. So how do they receive this? Do they not feel that truth, so what they call truth, is being edited? I'm just wondering what you can say about that. Thank you.
Okay, maybe anyone can jump in and respond, please. Thank you.
Can I say something? Oh.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I was just going to respond to the first comment, which is that's really what I was driving at in my paper, is why do we assume certain categories of analysis, and what is the contribution that might come from global studies of photography, how such studies might decenter the categories of analysis, because categories of analysis are, of course, about power and politics. We all know that. And, you know, to take an example, why do we assume the relevance of Walter Benjamin to photographic studies? Now, personally, I find him very, very interesting, but I mean, we have to recognize that that is a very historically located view of photography, responding to a very particular political moment at a very specific time in European history. And so, you know, how do we build our universals? And, you know, as Chakrabarti says, it's actually very, very difficult to divest yourself of universals. Because it's, you know, we're all acculturated in it. So I think, you know, I think what I was arguing is that we do need a much more sensitive and I'm not suggesting so much as a methodology, it's a set of sensibilities, I think, as to the kind of categories of analysis that we're using and where they're coming from and their appropriateness. Because I'm fascinated that we've had probably 20, 30 years of really interesting studies of global photographic practice and visual practice. And, you know, if you read the mainstream literature, you'd never know. And I think that's our problem. So I think you put your finger on it. Thank you.
May I say something brief?
Yes, yes.
I mean, the provocation, I think, touches on something that is tremendously important and something we at least in anthropology talked about very often, which is the inescapability of hegemony at a certain level of epistemology or political economy of knowledge or theory. But I want to briefly say something in a sort of devil's advocate sort of argument, which is that the other side of this would be the pursuit of a sort of pure indigenous native sphere that is unaffected from the hegemony of the North, hegemony of the sort of Central. And this has often led to nativist kind of Sishnandi's work and also other movements which try to locate the pure, the native, the exempt from the corrupting hegemonic. And in my case, for instance, when I showed you the nativist Cretans wearing the traditional attire and posing with their weapons, they would conceive of what they do as a sort of anti-Western, anti-everything, anti-structure. But in fact, if one looks carefully and historically at this material, you will see the trace of the romantic image within the construction of that native figure, because these photographs first circulated by romantic travelers, and then they were recirculated in the local community, and then they were sort of inflating what existed previously. So in other words, I want to say that there is no zone of absolute purity of an indigenous level which is unaffected from the hegemonic or the exterior. And the only solution I can think of to the very important provocation is heeding ethnographically very carefully, at heeding people's own sensibilities and trying to incorporate them with all of the problems that has in terms of representation, and trying to produce theory out of that, rather than perhaps putting Benjamin in there on top of what they've said, to go back to Elizabeth's comment.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way I was suggesting any sort of essential indigeneity and a purity. In fact, the reverse. I mean, what I would like to see one day is somebody analyze Stieglitz according to African concepts. See what happens. Might be interesting.
Indeed. So I'm just going to check the chat, see if there's quite a lot of people enjoying this provocation. We've got a couple of minutes. I wondered if either Karen or Chris has any parting comments to leave us.
Well, we didn't address George Agbo's question. Do you want me to?
Yes, please. Yes.
I would just say briefly that I would second what both Elizabeth and Kostis said in response to the provocation, which is something that I think we all are thinking about and grappling with all the time. And I do feel very strongly, as Kostis says, that you know, given my own positionality, the best thing I can do is do real ethnography that is about listening and attending to what is happening for people who may not occupy that authoritative position, and trying to in some way amplify it in my own work, and also, though, in my paper, also trying to create coevalness, right? To deny that belatedness, and to show how the image artists that I'm thinking about, and the brokers, the people practicing the art of resonance, are participants in a very asymmetrical world, but they are active and creative, and certainly not in any way derivative. And that's, I think, a very important point to make, that we are all occupying the same image world, even though we do so on asymmetrical footing. Just quickly to respond to George Agbo's questions about whether people feel that the truth has been edited. You know, in my book, I talk about sort of different modalities of image, and the two ones I mainly talk about are the evidentiary and the ludic. And by ludic, I mean images that have been sort of artfully played with, and where truth claims are made in a different kind of register on the surface of the image, as opposed to that evidentiary look back to some pre-photographic reality. And I think often, you know, what you see happening is that what circulates first is the sort of raw image, right? And it establishes a kind of truth claim. And from there, a process of artful, you know, distillation and creation of kind of memes, right? Adding text, adding, you know, you can see the image becoming more and more sort of stylized and simplified, and reduced and distilled. And that creates a different kind of potency. It's a different kind of truth that really draws out those kinds of resonances, as opposed to a truth claim that is about evidence. So I think that truth itself is established in different kinds of ways.
If I could just very briefly say something about the first question. I mean, it strikes me that what, you know, the ramifications of that question clearly far exceed the question of photography. But if one thought about the argument of Kostis's paper, I think, you know, one of the things that's so wonderful about it is it shows how photographs that may have been made in conditions of duress and of great power asymmetry, nevertheless, and in a way rather amazingly, can come to serve as mediators, as conciliators. And, you know, that emerges with extraordinary clarity in his work, I think.
Well, that's a great place to end our first session. I'm so glad that everything has started off in this very lively way. And we are going